Thomas Jefferson wrote All Men Are Created Equal, along with some of the most beautiful prose ever written about liberty, self-governance, and the natural rights of man. He also ran a nail factory at Monticello with child slaves as young as 10 years old. He wrote that 2 months of labor by the nail boys paid his family's grocery bill for a year. That's the contradiction most people know, and it's also where most people stop, either to condemn the founders as monsters or completely excuse them as men of their time. But here's the harder question. Why did they choose to protect slavery in the Constitution? And what would have happened if they'd chosen differently? The answers aren't black and white. I'm Ken LaCourte. I dig into uncomfortable topics to try and figure out the real story, not to make anyone feel good or bad about the past, but because the truth is always more interesting than the simplified versions we learn. We'll start with a look at the slaveholding founders, and then broaden that out with a look at slavery's long history, because the United States was a small part of that story. Then we'll get into the price of a country and the political realities that the founding fathers faced. And finally, what if they'd refused and there was no deal? By the end, I think you'll know things that most people miss entirely about how America began. So let's turn to the slaveholding founders, because it wasn't just a few one-offs who were part of it. The American Revolution, it wasn't organized or led by poor farmers or laborers. It was led by the elites, the wealthiest and most educated men in the colonies, lawyers, plantation owners, merchants. About 40% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. And at the Constitutional Convention a decade later, almost half owned slaves. They weren't just tolerating a system they inherited, many of them built their fortunes on it. George Washington owned more than 300 slaves at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson enslaved over 600 people during his lifetime. Slavery was embedded in the economy, the social structure, and the daily lives of the political class, and it funded their livelihoods. And while slavery operated in the South, it also helped Northern merchants. Northern ships carried slaves. Distilleries produced the rum traded for slaves in West Africa. And their textile mills, they ran on Southern cotton. The Northern economy was entangled with slavery, even in states that were abolishing it. President Washington, while serving in Philadelphia, he orchestrated a rotation scheme to move slaves out of Pennsylvania every 6 months to prevent them from claiming freedom under state law. When his enslaved cook Hercules escaped, Washington tried to have him hunted down. When another slave, Ona Judge, escaped during a family dinner, Washington used his presidential power to go after her. He sent customs officers and told the agents to seize her by surprise because he knew if she got advanced warning, she'd disappear. Thomas Jefferson called slavery a moral depravity and an abominable crime, then went home to Monticello and ran a plantation empire built entirely on forced labor. He fathered children with slave Sally Hemings, and when he died, his estate sold 130 slaves at auction to pay his debts. Benjamin Franklin owned slaves for decades and advertised their sale in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. Later in life, he became an abolitionist and headed the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, one of the first organizations in America dedicated to ending slavery. His final public act before dying in 1790 was unsuccessfully petitioning Congress to abolish slavery. Still, most of these men made personal choices every single day to keep owning people. And if you stop your history lesson looking at those actions and that hypocrisy, it's rational to come to the conclusion that they were horrible humans and that all that talk about liberty and equality was a great big scam. But pulling our focus out a bit, that'll give us some more context to judge that better. And as I often say, everything in life is more complicated than it looks at first. Now, look, it's weird that I even have to say this, but surveys say otherwise. Slavery wasn't invented in the Americas, or even by white people, not by a long shot. Slavery's long history essentially goes back as long as humanity. The Greeks did it, the Romans did it, the Chinese, the Arabs, Africans, even Catholic popes had slaves. Heck, at least one pope had actually been a slave. Virtually every society on earth had some form of slavery, and nobody seemed to think twice about it. Now, there's an argument, and it has some merit, that the slavery that came to the Americas was more brutal than the slavery beforehand. Chattel slavery, that essentially means human beings who are legally classified as property. Those slaves had no path to freedom, and slavery was passed down through their children. And in the Americas, it was also tied to race, making it especially hard to escape from. That said, we don't have much insight to what life was like for ancient slaves in Egypt or Rome. But the horrors of American slavery, they're well documented because it's more recent. We kept meticulous records like plantation ledgers, slave auctions and advertisements, runaway notices in newspapers. And the stories of slaves themselves made it vivid and clear in a way that ancient slavery just can't be. What we definitely know, though, is that the Atlantic slave trade industrialized slavery in a way the world had never seen. The numbers were massive, especially for the time. About 12 million Africans were forced onto slave ships between 1500 and the 1800s. About 2 million of them died on the journey over. It was simply horrific. And interestingly, though, only about 3.5%, like 1 in 28, landed in what would eventually become the United States. The rest were scattered across the Caribbean and South America, especially Brazil, which brought in 4 to 5 million Africans, about 10 times more than the United States itself. But as that trade was flourishing, human morality was starting to change. In the late 1600s, intellectuals like John Locke and Voltaire, they laid the groundwork for the ideas of liberty, natural rights, universal reason, the concepts that challenged the established hierarchy. And religion also played a real role in that as well. The evangelical revival of the 1700s saw a surge of emotional, populist Christianity, what historians call the Great Awakening. In America, many Northern abolitionists were products of that movement, and they took it as a duty to fight. That theological divide split national churches right down the middle. And the moral turnaround happened quickly. Just a few decades beforehand, most churches were either silent on slavery or totally complicit. And then, it wasn't too long before they were sending missionaries to preach against it and organizing boycotts. Of course, very few of the people who supported slavery saw themselves as the bad guys. I mean, people just don't do that. That's not how human brains work. They often cited the Bible as support, from the curse of Ham in Genesis to Paul's letters instructing servants to obey their masters. There was also racial science, which tried to prove that Africans were biologically suited for servitude. And then there was a paternalistic belief that they were essentially benevolent caretakers of a race that was incapable of governing itself. They argued that their slaves were fed, housed, and cared for in old age better than their counterparts across the ocean, and often better than the industrial workers in the North who worked themselves to death with no long-term security. So when the American founders were meeting in Philadelphia in 1787, slavery wasn't just some unique American evil. It had been a standard practice of every major empire and most of the world's economies. The question wasn't whether slavery was normal. It was. The question was whether the new country would be different. And it's also good to remember that essentially everyone, even abolitionists, had views on race that would be considered monstrous today. Heck, Abraham Lincoln, 70 years later at the fourth Lincoln-Douglas debate, he explained that he wasn't in favor of bringing in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. He made it clear that blacks shouldn't vote, serve on juries, hold office, or intermarry with whites. And he was the anti-slavery guy who essentially did more than any other American to end slavery. So it's easy to look back and sort history into good guys and bad guys. It's also too simple. And to be honest, you and I aren't getting off the hook. Do you own a smartphone? Well, they have a few grams of cobalt in them. And most of that comes from the Congo, where tens of thousands of young kids work in mines in horrific conditions. Heck, I live in a wealthy American city where I drive by people in obvious distress and I do nothing. If they had a broken leg, I'd stop traffic to get them help. But instead, they have something wrong with their brain, and our society essentially enables them to keep living in misery. Values change, and someday we may all be the bad guys. Now, that doesn't erase the brutality of slavery, where children were sold from their mothers, but it gives perspective. So when you look at history like this, you can see that sometimes macroeconomic changes can happen pretty quickly. I was recently on the phone with a nationally known financial commentator who is absolutely convinced that both the stock market and the real estate are in massive bubbles about to pop. Is he right? I have no idea. I've heard smart people say that a lot, but sometimes they're right. That's why smarter people who've saved some money don't just chase the highest returns, they diversify. And they diversify into baskets that aren't all likely to get hit and drop together. For many of them, one of those baskets is gold. Today's sponsor, it's Augusta Precious Metals, and they make buying physical gold easy, and that takes expertise. They store it under your name in a bonded facility. They help you own it legally inside of an IRA with the tax advantages that go along with that. Their fees are reasonable. I even did a video conference and saw that it was solid, useful information, and there was zero sales pressure. Augusta's been around for about a decade, and reviews of them are great. So if you've been thinking at all about investing in gold, check them out, see if it makes sense for you. Go to kenforgold.com or text RETIRE to 35052 for more info. Now back to some history. So as I mentioned, America's founding fathers were enmeshed with slavery, but they were also the generation that built a bridge from a world with slaves to a country without them. And they did that through something we tend to consider dirty: politics. So to understand the price of a country, let's go back to 1787. The American Revolution had ended 4 years earlier. 13 British colonies had just won their independence and needed to figure out how to govern themselves. They originally tried the Articles of Confederation, basically a loose alliance where each state stayed mostly independent. Congress couldn't collect taxes, so there was no money to pay soldiers or debts. Laws couldn't be enforced across state lines. They even printed their own money and taxed goods from other states. And some of these states were negotiating separate deals with Britain and France. Britain still had troops in Canada and forts on American soil. The European powers were watching to see if the new Confederation would collapse, and if it did, they'd swoop back in. Benjamin Franklin said during the Revolution, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." And by 1787, that wasn't just a witty line. It was the choice they actually faced. So in May of that year, delegates met in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Their job was to create a real government that could hold the country together. But to do that, everyone in the room had to agree, and slavery was a deal breaker. The convention was a negotiation between states with completely different economies. The northern states were moving towards trade and early manufacturing. The southern states, they ran plantation economies entirely dependent on slave labor. Some of those states made it clear they needed slavery protections. The South had the votes and the willingness to walk, and that meant no union, no country at all. So the Founding Fathers made calculated compromises that protected slavery in the Constitution. Of course, they didn't use the word. They used euphemisms like other persons and person held to service or labor. One of the things that came out of the negotiations was the 3/5 compromise, which gave slave states more political power by counting slaves towards representation. Under that compromise, every 5 slaves counted as 3 persons when calculating how many congressional seats or electoral votes a state got. Of course, the slaves couldn't vote and they had 0 rights, but they gave their states extra power. I mean, President Jefferson likely won the presidency in 1800 because of those extra electoral votes. And for the first 32 of 36 years under the Constitution, the president was a slave-holding white man from Virginia. They also had a clause that Congress couldn't touch the importation of slaves until 1808. The Constitution explicitly blocked any amendment that might change that protection during those 20 years. The fugitive slave provision required states to return escaped slaves even if they'd fled to free states. So the federal government essentially became the enforcement arm of slavery. Every one of those concessions was the price of building one united country. But while the convention was protecting slavery in some places, Congress was banning it in others. In the same year as the Constitutional Convention, Congress banned slavery in what would become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. It created the first large region of guaranteed free states, and decades later, that helped tip the balance of political power against slavery and in electing Abraham Lincoln. So, interestingly, many founders sincerely believed that slavery would die out on its own. When you study the economics of slavery, you learn that there were serious costs that often made paid labor cheaper. So there were real reasons to think that the problem might just solve itself without tearing the country apart. But in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. And instead of fading away, slavery exploded. The South went from producing just a few thousand bales of cotton in 1790 to over 4 million bales 70 years later. Cotton became more valuable than all other American exports combined. And with that, the slave population grew right along with it, from about 700,000 people to nearly 4 million within the same time period. The price of slaves tripled, and the slave trade became a massive industry. The bet that slavery would die out on its own was wrong, and it took a war that killed over 600,000 people to settle what politics couldn't. Hey, as always, if I mess up something serious here, let me know. I'll fix it in the comments and in a description box. You can also find my sources and notes down there. Okay, so here's an interesting question. What if the Founding Fathers said no to slavery and told the South no deal? So some of this we can be pretty confident about, some of it a bit less so. Almost certainly, the South walks out. The Union fragments before it starts. And remember, without the South, the Revolutionary War probably wouldn't have succeeded in the first place. The Revolution needed all the men and money the colonies had. Britain was still the most powerful empire on earth, and it was still actively looking for ways to reassert control, or at least keep the former colonies weak and divided. Without Southern manpower, resources, and territory, the Northern colonies probably couldn't sustain independence. It's very likely that Britain would pick off individual colonies, negotiate agreements that kept them dependent, or simply wait out until they collapsed under their own weight. There's no United States. Maybe a Northern Confederation, maybe separate countries of Massachusetts and New York, or smaller confederacies. But without the South's population and economic resources, they'd be vulnerable. And here's a part that makes it contradictory and a bit uncomfortable. Slavery probably wouldn't have just persisted in the South through 1860. The odds are good that it would have lasted longer. Some countries, like Cuba and Brazil, they didn't end slavery until the late 1800s. A stronger independent South with no federal government forcing the issue, it's very likely that they could have maintained slavery into the early 1900s. Now, there are counterarguments to this, and some historians believe that the Union actually prolonged slavery and that weakened South would have had to abandon it earlier, but most disagree. What we know for sure is that the Founders' Compromise didn't solve slavery, but it did build the institution that did. The federal government they created became the mechanism that ended slavery 78 years after it was formed. That union produced Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, and a constitution that added the 13th Amendment that outlawed slavery nationwide. So yes, the union the founders built was flawed from the start, but the alternative was likely no country at all, and more human suffering, not less. And like most historical issues, even the ones that seem obvious, it's all more complicated than we'd like to admit. Hey, if you want to deep dive into this issue further, the elimination of slavery in the world goes much further than Lincoln and the U.S. There's a fascinating story behind why the world abandoned slavery. I mean, for the non-slaves, it seemed like a pretty good deal. And it's complicated. It was a combination of a new morality, economic changes, and a crusade of one country, not the United States. Again, the truth is never simple. Thanks for watching. I hope I did a fair job at this. I hope you found it worth your time. See you next time.